And my grandfather had been governor of Transylvania. More than that, my grandfather, for a while, was in the parliament of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, arrested 30 times for protesting against the deeds of the Hungarians against the minority Romanians in Transylvania. In fact, it was probably 50-50 split between Romanian and Hungarians. But anyway, the Hungarians were in control of the area and the parliament. And in fact, my grandfather represented Romania and negotiated to take most of Transylvania and make Romania the larger portion of the country that it is today by acquiring the Transylvania, if you will, as part of Romania. That was my grandfather. And the last part of the story of my grandparents on my mother's side was that the fact that there was a Bocu, which was my grandfather's name, B-O-C-U, in the history books. He was a leader of the rebels under the Turks who had taken over Romania, and he wanted, the Turks wanted lots of grain and corn from Romania, which was agrarian, it was the factory for Europe in terms of all the fundamental agricultural produce. And anyway, he was not happy with them, and so he got a bunch of Romanians to rebel, and so he was arrested and killed in the public square, and so he became a hero of the Romanian peasants several centuries before. Interestingly, after the communists took over, he was in the history books until about 1948, 47, when all of a sudden that peasant rebel was eradicated from history because that was my grandfather's name. He was a famous politician.
Right.
And so they erased that whole story. But anyway, that's the reality. My mother went through college, educated in France at the Sorbonne, came to Romania, they met in Romania, married, and that's the story.
Was politics part of your dad and mom's life?
Very much so. We went with my grandmother and grandfather, as I mentioned. My father was shortly arrested by the Nazi-sympathizing Romanian regime with the Germans, who took over Romania, in essence, in a quiet coup because there was a strong pro-Nazi sentiment in Romania at the time. So they arrested my father, who was judged to be part of the Allies because he worked for the Americans. And from prison, my dad started to work for the OSS. My mother became the courier.
No kidding.
So it was great for him. They organized all kinds of mischief against the Germans from prison.
Your dad?
My dad. Because he was the mayor, if you will, of the prison. A lot of prominent politicians and so forth. But because of his English and because his connection with the OSS, he became sort of the leader of this cabal. And what's interesting about that, there was a fellow called Frank Wisner, who was my father's control out of Istanbul, that communicated discreetly and with my mother, who used to put messages in. She was a smoker in the matchbacks, and she wasn't searched as she came into the prison. They got to know her. So my mother had quite free access to my dad in visitations. So that guy was Frank Wisner, as I mentioned, and Frank was one of the four folks that moved from the OSS and started the CIA.
Sure.
And he was a very critical, important actor in our story. And his son, Frank, also Jr., one of my best friends for life, classmate when I went to Princeton, and ambassador to many countries, including India and Egypt in Cairo, where he had 500 people, including the CIA, wandering around. So, small world story. So anyway, so that's the setup for 1939. And when the war started, and that's what happened, we were in Transylvania, in this small little town, my parents in prison, or my father in prison, my mother doing her thing. And then, so the war was not horrible for us in Transylvania because the Germans came, the Russians came through it, but it wasn't like bombs exploding left and right. There was some fighting, but not extraordinary. And it was just the separation from my parents and the anxiety for us, not knowing whether my parents would come out alive out of this. My grandparents tried to keep a sort of cool about this thing, but it was obvious that there was huge concern about the future. So the war is now over. A coup against the Germans as they were placing, really trying to escape the Russian army coming in, got into a lot of trouble because of the plans that were put in place from the prison that was organized to really aggressively make it difficult for the Germans to get out easily. So anyway, things happen, and then we reunite with our parents in Bucharest.
About when? What time period?
This is now the very end of 45.
Okay.
And from the
I
beginning,
guess, you would have been at that 7 years old.
7 years old.
And do you recall any sort of celebration or any note that the war had ended in Europe? VE Day, did that mean anything to you in Transylvania?
Not in Transylvania. Yes, in Transylvania. Not much.
Yeah.
No.
Just curious.
I don't recall. I think we celebrated the fact my father was alive and out of prison. That was the big thing to a 7-year-old.
Was there communication during that time period?
Zero.
Zero. So you didn't know what was going on when he's in prison?
No, of course, or that he worked for the OSS or any of that stuff.
So you're with your grandparents in Transylvania.
Going to school when the school was up.
Yeah.
The usual, kind of normal, but wasn't normal because they were either the Germans and then the Russians. So it was not quite simple, but there was a sense of normalcy, if you will. Yeah, until we got to Bucharest, and then there was normalcy. Then we finally were a family.
Yeah.
2 boys with their parents. And it was great. That's when I learned how to ride a bike. I remember my dad, in fact, letting go at some point in time. And there I was, biking, with pride and glee and happiness and joy, what a kid would do.
This is the personal part, but you're with your grandfather, grandmother, and all of a sudden you see your mom and dad, who you hadn't
seen, remember, of course.
You remember because you were too young. So what was that moment like? That kind of like you married? Do you recall?
Weird, a little strange. I was not particularly shy as a boy. My grandfather, being a very popular man in town, he would walk down the street, people would everybody wore a hat, of course, in those days. But everybody would take their hats as they came close to my grandfather. Or in church, everybody would bow to him. He's a big man in Romania in those days. So I was treated with some respect because I was part of the family, and we had lots of land and vineyards, and we grew all the trees and this. I don't remember we ever went shopping because we had everything. Yeah. We had the grain, the grapes, the wines were made there. I was stomping the grapes in the barrels, and as a kid I remember that vividly. So it was a normal kind of life in Romania, but I was an outgoing child. exposed to all kinds of good things, and so I wasn't particularly reticent or particularly shy as a young boy. And so I became a people person pretty early on and continued to be that way pretty much my life. I was comfortable with people and being around with adults and so forth. And that served me well all my life, yeah.
So during that time period when you're 45, 46, you're kind of back together as a family. Now, your dad was working with Standard Oil at the time?
Yes, he was working with Standard Oil, but he was also an internationalist. Americans and Brits would come in and out of the house. The top politicians in Romania were at dinner with us and so forth. So it was a very interesting time that year, and almost unique, if you will, certainly for a 7-year-old boy. And it was most enjoyable, and to meet all these amazing people. It was great.
But wasn't he also sort of an agent for the British at the time?
Well, he was an agent. He was, he had been with the OSS, and to my knowledge, he was continuing that through that period of time in Romania. He was very much continued to work with the Brits and the Allies.
Was he involved in politics at all with the regime?
Yes, he was. They asked him to become a minister of economics. And he played that role in Romania during 1946, yes. In fact, I remember him telling me of an interesting historical saga that is remarkable, and to my knowledge, an important fact that is unknown and remain unknown. And the story goes like this. The prime minister, who used to be in and out of our home, Iuliu Maniu was his name, and the king found themselves asking my dad to meet with Averell Harriman, Ambassador Harriman, who was just coming out of Yalta at the meeting between Churchill and Stalin. And the reason the king and the prime minister wanted to chat with Harriman was this. And they stated so to Averell Harriman when they did meet in person. And they said, Mr. Ambassador, we are under pressure right now from the Russians and from the Communist Party in Romania, which was the minority, but a very vociferous and strong minority, supported by the Russian army, which was in Romania. However, the Romanian army, which was fighting against the Germans once the Russians came in, was armed. And the pressure was on the government to demilitarize the army. And the prime minister was concerned about the stability between Russia and the Allies and the pressures that the Communist Party was putting on the government at the time. And they said to Averell Harriman, Mr. Ambassador, here's our situation. We are armed, pressure to disarm. Will the Allies protect free elections in Romania or not? And it's important because if you are going to protect us and support free elections, we'll disarm immediately. Otherwise, you don't have to tell us anything. We just wish you a good day, and we thank you for coming to visit with us. That's all we ask. And Harriman said, I came from Yalta. I met with Stalin and President Roosevelt. Of course, I was in most meetings, and I assure you, there was no deal to separate Europe in two. So disarm. The rest is history. America was not a part of anything, and the Romanians were sitting ducks to the Russian army that was there,
Yeah.
and the Romanian army was disarmed. So that is when the coup really took place. Was a bloodless coup because the Russian army was all over the place,
Yeah.
and Romania and the rest of Eastern Europe became that part of the Soviet Empire, and the Cold War began.
As your dad told the story, did he feel it was a complete deception, or was it just malfeasance, misfeasance, nonfeasance?
Well, I was told the story directly as I just reported it to you. The only other thing my father said, I tried to speak to Averell Harriman while he was alive many, many times. Went to his office, called him at his home. He would never see me. He would never talk to me. It is inconceivable that Averell Harriman didn't know.
Yeah.
It was malfeasance,
Yeah.
in my opinion. That's my deduction.
Yeah. Wow.
How history turns.
Yeah.
These are little things that are so amazingly crucial. Who knows what would have happened, but it's history.
Well, obviously it affected you dramatically because the Iron Curtain did come down.
Well, but here's what happened. At the very beginning of January, my recollection of 1947, my father and mother left for New York because there was a worldwide managers meeting in New York City at 30 Rockefeller Plaza, which was the headquarters of Exxon or Esso in those days. And it was a 2-week trip. We were in school. My grandparents came to New York to babysit for us while they were in New York for those 2 weeks. Retrospectively, the Iron Curtain comes during that 2-week period. My father now and mother are agonizing. My father talks to his friends from the OSS in America and said, I'm going back to Romania. I'll leave my wife here, but I'm going back to Romania to protect my kids. And they told my father, Rica, that was his nickname, from Valerica Rica. Rica was his nickname. Rica, you can't go back to Romania. We saw the list. There's a lot of all prominent people, influential people in Romania. You and your wife are close to the top of the list to be arrested and killed. How are you going to protect your kids? You got to stay. Turbulent times for my parents. How could they leave their kids alone in these turbulent times? Wisely, they stayed. Hard decision for them to make. Hard decision. But they were convinced, because he knew the people involved. They were his pals. And of course they were right. 300,000 Romanians, influentials in politics, in religion, in business, anybody who was thought to be a potential threat to the communist regime was rounded up and killed. A few of them were arrested. My grandfather was picked up in the middle of the night. I remember vividly that moment. And of course, we never saw him again. We didn't know what had happened to them. What happened to him, he was sent to a prison in Sighet, northern Romania. A couple of hundred. The prison is now a museum where Barbara, my wife, and I took our grandkids and our son to see the prison.
Mm-hmm.
And we saw the cell, and there's a plaque there. And he was murdered in his cell. So that's what had happened at that time. And the rest of the 300,000 were asked to dig holes for a canal. There was a canal that they were working on that was going nowhere, except to keep them working 10, 12 hours a day, underclothed, heavy. Winters were really brutal in Romania, underfed. Within less than 2 years, they're all dead. No no crematoriums for them.
Right.
They learned from the Germans. So that was the story of what happened and what would have happened to my father and mother. So we're very fortunate because they were in the States and we were in Romania. Back in Transylvania now, back in school, I was forced to wear the pioneer red cravat, a tight sort of. And I was looking for my great-grandfather, Paul Boku. No more. He was no longer. In fact, by accident, I discovered, because I had read this story before, but in the new books under the communists, there was rewritten history.
Rewritten out of history. Now, were you under a former house arrest? Was that how it really worked?
No. What happened is they had a pretty big estate that was half museum of Romanian peasant clothing, which my grandmother collected from all over Romania. It was a brilliant museum of Romanian traditional clothing and books, and I don't know, 7,000 or 8,000 volume of books. All of that was taken over. They took 3 days to burn all the books, they said, as we heard later from people. And all the costume disappeared. They were stolen, or who knows what happened. But it's still a museum now. We went back to that place. But anyway, that was then. And they came to us and they said, you're going to be on a train. You're going to go to past Bucharest to the place. From there, you'll be taken by boat on the Danube and taken to meet with your parents in Austria or someplace. So that was the pretext. In reality, they took us to a town, well, 2 towns, but eventually we ended up in a town called Botoșani, close to the Russian border, in Romanian part of Moldova. And that's where we spent the next 5 years. I was cleaning sewers. What happened, they took a room out of somebody's house. Our bed was a bunch of fresh hay, which is nice. I remember the aroma. I can sense it now. A bunch of blankets, a little oil lamp. The toilet was the outhouse in the back. There was a well that you had to pump fresh water. And that's it. And the clothes that we had on. And went to work. For the first 6 or 7 months, we had a secret policeman that would take us to work, and then he disappeared. Nobody could move from a little town. There was no reason to escape. Where would you go? A local peasant, to go from Botoșani to the next town, would need approval from the local police. And they had to explain why, what was the purpose of the trip to this other town, and you go to the other town to the police and tell them, this is why I'm here to do this. That's the kind of control. That was control autocracy at its nth degree. And so we went to work, left home at 6 in the morning, and came back about 6 or so. The way you got your food is at the store. There was only an open store that the communists had, and you had a ration card. And the ration card was dependent on the degree of labor that you put on. And so we got so many slices of bacon, some garlic cloves. I'm now allergic to garlic. I don't know where that happened, but I ate a lot of garlic in those days. And so many ounces of bread and milk. And that was life. That was life for 5 years. Cleaned sewers for a bunch of time, did holes for telephone poles. I worked on electric high tension wires. And that was going to be life.
Yeah.
We had no idea, no contact, of course, with anybody. None, 0 for 5 years. There were no books, there was no schooling, no nothing. Except my grandmother was with us. She was under house arrest, she couldn't leave the house. But at least we had an adult with us.
Right.
And somebody would keep telling us, And then for entertainment, I'm being sarcastic, about every other month we would be taken to brainwashing session, where we were told how terrible our parents were. And they were traitors to America. We didn't want to.
Very specifically.
Oh, yeah. Traitors well, most importantly to Romania and the communist government. They were trying to do this because they were working with the Americans, and shame on them, and how disgraceful it is that they are that.
By the way, just did you have any correspondence? Was there anything during that time period? They're in New York City, or in America, a year there in a kind of an outpost of Romania. Was there did your grandmother know anything was going on?
Of course not.
So whatever you heard.
There was not a pen or pencil in the room.
Yeah.
There was not a pad. There were no books, nothing.
So other than this brainwash session, which they talk about your mom and dad being traitors,
Right.
that was the sum and substance of
That's it.
that they were alive.
Yes.
I mean,
We didn't know where they were.
yeah. Wow.
No idea. Nor did they.
Yeah.
Nor did they. Once they took us away from that little town in Lipovan, where we did correspond.
Yeah.
Nothing.
Yeah.
Total veil of nothing. So anyway.
By the way,
that is like-
I digress for a second, Peter, but how did you and your brother cope with all that? I mean, did you have fear factor that they were not alive? It's the fear of the unknown?
I don't think that was the issue. The issue was us. And how would we manage to live the rest of our lives doing this? There was no alternative. I remember the cartoon. They had, the cartoon was two prisoners, mostly undressed, and they had their hands up, tied in, with the arm spread out, eagle, the legs equally in chains, both arms and legs in chains, next to each other. And one guy turns to the other, says, "So what's the plan?" And it was a little bit like that. Retrospect, I saw that cartoon much later on, but I said, that was us.
Yeah.
That was us. There was you couldn't move anywhere, you couldn't go anywhere.
Wow.
We just had to say the rest of the life was working like we're working. We never talked about a future or a different future. The only thing we talked about with my grandmother is how wonderful your parents are. They're good people, they're caring people. It's going to end up being okay.
Yeah.
And my grandfather was a very religious man. And as a young man, I kind of found Jesus Christ to be a cool dude. I loved the stories about Jesus Christ and how he did. And he was a bit of a rebel, and I was a little bit of a rebel too. Because I used to yell at these guys. I was a young kid, and to the interrogators, they were secret police. In fact, they were not so secret. In fact, I remember sometimes they came in uniform with long, big boots and stuff. I was on the floor, and they were on a table with dangling boots in front of my face. And I used to yell at them. I was terrified inside. I mean, terrified. And the more terrified I was, the more vociferous I became. Yelling at them, screaming at them. So, but we never, my brother and I and my grandmother never talked about the future. There was no way to project other than life is what is. Life is going to be what is. There's nothing else. At least that was the mindset at the time. And I tried, maybe to some degree my survival was, I decided in my own mind, without discussing with my brother and my grandmother, I decided that I would try to work harder than anybody else to demonstrate my value as a worker. That I could work as hard and be as valuable as any of the men out there. And I would clearly be recognized for my prowess and my hard work and my work ethic. And I think that helped me. That was my purpose.
Sure. Meanwhile, back in the United States, your mom and dad are not giving up hope.
They didn't. They tried any number of early, particularly in the early days before they arrested us, to try to get us out with adventures, borrowed enormous amounts of money to pay for adventures to get us out. Obviously, they all failed. So that's stories, but nothing worked. And then in 1953, it became, in retrospectively, of course, clear. So we're now 5 years under arrest in this working conditions. They sent a diplomat to represent Romania and the Soviet Union to say to my father that if he wanted to see his children again, he would have to spy and provide information to the Russians and to the Romanians. And he had contacted my father, and they met in my father's office. And my father said to him, I can't do that. I mean, how can I do that? I had become an American citizen at the time, because they knew they could never return to communist Romania. He said, well, that's not a problem for us, that you're an American citizen. Yeah. Well, perhaps it's a problem for me. Well, you think about that if you want to see your kids again. So that was the end of that story. So then he went home, and it must have been a horrific evening for my father and mother. The following morning, my father went to the FBI and said, this is what happened. What do I do? They said, become a double agent. He said, I don't want to do that. I've seen that play before many times in my life. It just never ends well. Either I can't do it or they don't want to do it. What else? Go public, they said, eventually. The story was you go public, get to the newspapers, create a scandal. The Soviet Union, Russia at the time said, they wanted to be perceived by the world as being much more civilized and much more with it than America. So they would be likely afraid to kill the kids because they knew they had the kids. So I said, that's the best thing we can do, and then we'll see what we do after that, but that's what you should do right now. That's what my parents did. And they said, by the way, if we can't get the story to really catch fire, we'll flame it. We have contacts with media, and we'll get the story out there. Not necessary. In fact, every little town and local newspaper in America had the story of the Georgescu blackmail story. Front page. One of the persons who read that story was Frances Payne Bolton, Congresswoman from Ohio. And she called my dad up. There's a real story about Frances Bolton. And God bless her, I got to know her real well. She called my father and said, I'll get your boys out. Don't worry about it. And she tried. Spent a year doing all kinds of stuff, talking to Molotov, the Russian diplomats, foreign minister, whatever. The Russian says the Romanians have control. The Romanians say, no, it's the Russians that have control, whatever. So she got tired of that, went to Ike, and she was responsible, very responsible to get Ike elected in 1952. And so, anyway, went to Ike and said, whatever happens, probably get the boys out of Romania, please, Mr. President. And so as we understood this story, we got traded for a bunch of Russian spies. Once I tried, maybe 20, 30 years later, I tried to find out from a CIA agent who came to see me in my office, because Frank Wisner and others had said, what do you have in your records about the Georgescu story? And they said, we don't have anything. And he said, in those days, they did these kinds of things, often meaning the trades. Mm-hmm. But they deliberately didn't want to keep records of those.
Really?
So they didn't. So, because I wanted to go to Russia.
Sure.
To find out from the guys, hey, how is it for you? Here's what happened to me. I mean, there was a kinship there, but it never happened.
Sort of a bridge of spies type thing, yeah.
Exactly, exactly.
So how do you get the word? You know, this is all going on in the United States, you know, Congresswoman Bolton, and I know you've spoken at great depth about her as a force of nature.
Oh my God, she was a force of nature.
Yeah. And really the heroine of the story. But at some point on the other side in Europe, how do you get the word?
Oh no, they came to us and said, you're now free to go and go to Bucharest. Your passports will be there. We didn't believe them at the time, but we went to that. One of my grandmother's brothers was a very famous Romanian actor. And he was held in high regard, so we stayed with him for a couple of weeks while the paperwork were done. And then the American Council in Romania escorted us by train to Vienna, where we met my father. And from Vienna, we flew to London. From London, we got on a Pan Am Clipper, first class, mind-boggling.
There's a great video, a movie of it, newsreel, I should say, of that. And
arrival at Idlewild Airport now in Kennedy.
It's spectacular, and there you are.
There we are, off the plane, with cameras and the bulbs flashing.
Yeah.
It was amazing.
Headlines. I got to go back to when you meet your dad in Vienna, which is the second time. This is the second time you have this gap of huge years where you're out without your parents in there.
It was. I see the train station right now as I'm talking to you. I see it. I see him. I see him with a grin on his face. Yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah,
it's amazing. Incredulous story from where we were to this, because we didn't believe it. But they didn't let my grandmother out at that time. She came out only 10 years later. So cruel, so cruel. Anyway, so.
There, then the next thing you know, the
newsreel. Yeah, and the same thing in New York, famous for 2 weeks.
David Garraway's show and everything.
Ed Sullivan.
Ed Sullivan. Wow.
And then another, but this is part of the story. And this is the story of compassion and care of the American people. We started with, the thing that did it was the publicity of the blackmail. That's what really gave pause to the Russians not to kill us. And also explained, by the way, why they kept us alive.
Right.
We're just the bait.
Right.
Got to keep the bait alive. And so.
Well, and you had to have an advocate, and you had one in the Congresswoman Bolton.
Yes, exactly. Well, I have a Hall of Fame.
Yeah.
She's up there, one of the big ones in the Hall of Fame. The other one was the Exeter principal, William Gurdon Saltonstall, who calls my dad, said, "I'll keep a place for your young son." And my dad says, he doesn't speak a word of English. He's got a 4th grade education. He said, well, but he learned lots of other things. And so I went. And he told me when I met him, he said, if you can pass your courses at the end of the year without consideration for your background, you get to stay. Otherwise, I'll find the right school for him. Because there was no way for them to test me, or IQ, or whatever. I had no knowledge. And certainly, is this guy an idiot or not? And so I did pass the course. And the sad part was, on the way out the door, I was with my dad. He obviously liked me. I don't know why, but he did. And on the way out the door, he said, what grade would you like to be in? I had no clue what the hell he was talking about. So I said, I want to be with boys my own age. I was 15. That made me a sophomore in high school. So I only spent 3 years at Exeter. But I passed. Barely, but I passed. But then I did well enough to get into Princeton, and then I went to Harvard Business School. The rest of the story is pretty much an normal American story.
Well, I don't know that's an understatement about
Well,
you being
there you
normal.
go. Yeah, maybe I'm not normal.
Yeah.
Still, I'm not very normal.
No, it's an unbelievable story, but it seems to me Congresswoman Bolton also was involved in getting you to Stanford, wasn't she?
Well, she paid for it.
Yeah. She paid for it.
Yeah.
Wow, so she continued to take
Yes.
an interest in
Yes.
you
Yes.
after you're here.
Yes.
Wow.
And she had me from Stanford. I went 2 or 3 times, I can't remember exactly. I flew to Palm Beach where they had an estate. Because she was interested, not interested in me, interested in what was going on in school, what I was learning. And even after, when I was in business, my father came up a few times. I was at young Rubicam in the early days, and even Barbara met her. My wife Barbara and I would meet her. And it was just an extraordinary woman. Sure, but clearly 2 people in the Hall of Fame. But that caring and compassion that the American people or teachers in my school, throughout my life, I had so many people to help me. And that was America at its very best, and still is America at its very best. And I never forgot that. If I have a chance, I usually try to be of help to people. I'll never forget how generous and kind, how remarkably well I was treated when I needed help.
Well, you've given that back in spades throughout the rest of your career, and you're known through Young and Rubicam. I mean, you rise, a meteoric rise from just a low level. 40 years later,
Yeah.
I mean 40 years later, but you're
I was
chairman.
a trainee coming in, and then I ran the company.
So pause. But wasn't preordained when you got out of business school. Your dad was in the Standard Oil business.
Yeah.
Were you-
No,
Well, you still.
by accident, it's too long a story. I was told by one of the deans of the school, asked me a favor. He was a friend, because we used to talk about it, and I never bothered the placement director, dean, for anything, because Standard Oil offered me a job at Exxon International if I got my MBA. So I had a job. But then he said, you got to go interview this guy. And so I interviewed this guy. I didn't know a thing about it. But he explained that I would have to spend 40 years in research, and here's what the research was about: learning people, and not only the demographic, but the psychographics of people, why they behave, how they think, and so forth. Boy, did that appeal to me. So I came to New York. I told Esso, I'm going to go to Young Rubicam. My father was destroyed. He was so unhappy. But anyway, so it worked out okay.
Yeah, it did. I'm going to totally digress here for a second, because we're at the Robert H. Jackson Center, and one of our heroes is Harold Burson. And part of Young and Rubicam's orbit was the big private entity, Burson and Marsteller. And through that process, you got to meet the only guy who ever interviewed, through his questioning, Robert Jackson at Nuremberg, Harold Burson, who was right there, right where you're sitting a couple times. And I became fond of Harold Burson, and then we talked about it. But from your perspective, and again, we're over here someplace, but talk to me about Harold Burson.
Well, Harold Burson he was a very diminutive person, as you remember. A shortish, a little gray hair, not a whole lot of it, with glasses, from Memphis, so with a southern accent, charming, with a wonderful smile. His face, small face, would just light up like a Christmas tree, and he'd talk to you. And I remember, I'll tell you this, our company acquired Burson Marsteller. We acquired lots of companies in PR and direct marketing, promotion, landowner and design. We had the leaders of every marketing communication company, and we were in consulting business at the time as well. But I became very friendly with Harold because he was a giant. And I remember on his, I think, 70th birthday. And I was invited to go. I was CEO at the time. And I said, I got to go to see my friend and give him a hug. And there was a room, he was speaking, and there were, in a large rooms, about like as big as this place, this theater is, there were probably about 60, 70 CEOs. It's who's who in American business. Everybody in the Fortune, the top 50 of the Fortune 100 were in that room. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden, as I walked in, they were screaming, standing up screaming, Harold, 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 for this little guy. He was a giant.
Yeah.
Intellectually. And the reason was, he was a smart guy, but he wasn't that. He was wise, but wasn't that enough? Trust. Mm-hmm. They learned to trust him.
Yeah.
He knew right from wrong. He stood for truth. He always helped out. He always told what was on his mind. Whether he wanted to hear it or not, he would.
Yep.
And so he was beloved by top of American businessmen. Nobody like him that I ever met in my life.
Yeah. Well, like I say, we were blessed to have him here a few times, and especially he fond of the Nuremberg story and his participation and all of that. So you've accomplished so much, but I know part of what we want to accomplish today is the fact of maybe discussing from your background. I mean, in many places, you got to know where you came from to know where you're going to. And you've had experiences extraordinary. You're an author extraordinary. You've written 3 books, many publications, tremendous amount of interviews. But I know there's that part of the Jackson Center, and we're doing some programming in the near future on democracy and history. And I wonder, it's a question posed, but tell us about democracy. For example, what does democracy mean to you, Peter Georgescu? How do you think our current political processes impact democracy? And is there something that you would change to make it better?
Yes. I think, let me talk about democracy first of all. To me, democracy is very simple. Democracy is people. It's about people. Of the people. For the people, the government. By the people. Mm-hmm. That's democracy. Very simple. It's a political system, an economic system, where the whole focus of attention is on the people. The people should inspire the future. It should be run by the people for the benefit of the people. At the end of the day, that's America was about. It was in the Declaration of Independence. It was embedded in the Constitution. All men are created equal. That was a dream, was an aspiration, was written by Jefferson. I mean, it wasn't reality. But that was the journey that America, the idea of America would become, where all men that are created equal. He knew what he was talking about. He also knew that it wasn't that then. He was hoping someday we'd be there. And I'm sitting here talking to you, hoping the same thing. And that all of us are entitled to the pursuit of happiness. And that's, to me, the cornerstone of America's democracy, or the idea of what the American experiment was all about, and is all about. And I want to spend as much of my energy and influence to make sure that we can make this thing to happen. And I look at it from a business perspective, because that was my career in business. And I got interested in business's potential, and I began to understand that America went astray, the American business went astray when it changed its version of capitalism. And what people don't understand, capitalism is not one thing. Capitalism, to me, is like an engine. When you have access to things like capital, and you have access to resources, human resources, and all kinds of other resources, depending on what your business is about. And when you believe in taking prudent risk, and when you believe in the important role of that rewards and incentives for your people can be given, and you believe in both the long-term and short-term version of value creation, when all of those things come together, it's like a hurricane that requires so much air pressure, and water has to be so much warmer, and everything else, or a tornado. You know, all of a sudden, when all these things come together, boom, the explosive hurricane. Capitalism is like that, this engine that knows how to produce wealth. It is not, it doesn't have an ethic, it doesn't have morality at all. It's just a thing that happens. But then the governance comes along because it demands to know who benefits from this wealth creation. And the beneficiaries set the rules of the road, and the rest just goes on. And that's why there are so many versions of capitalism, not of capitalism, but different governances. And this is what China, under Deng Xiaoping, became capitalistic, because he understood that he would be. And he needed that because Mao's economic philosophy would not produce nothing. And he understood that, and he said, we gotta have capitalism work for us. And he did, because he didn't care. That engine doesn't care. He doesn't know or care about who the beneficiary is. Just give me free access to this and free access to this, and here are the principles, prudent investment, use lots of rewards, and that's why Jack Ma in China became a very wealthy man, rich man, because Deng Xiaoping understood that it has to be that way. And Xi Jinping does not understand that, because for Xi Jinping, philosophy and communist philosophy trumps everything else. And that's why he's going to fail economically. And America, from 45 to 82, roughly, was worrying about the customer, the workers, the shareholders, and the communities, and became the most important force and dominant force in the world because it worked. And then in 82, the powers of being business and the Reagan government said, nah, we're paying the workers too much. Let's get rid of the unions. Let's do this. We don't have to pay them that much. And for the next 40 years, 60% of America, the workers and so forth, their wages went up with inflation or below inflation for 40 years. Not a dollar's war.
Yeah.
So inequality, we became from the most democratic country in the world to the most unequal nation economically and the most immobile society in the developed world. And that's why we are in the mess we are today. It was created by business, not just government, business. And these poor folks, the so-called MAGA group, whatever, the poor folks were the private good education which comes from that economic process. And they became the anarchists, but that's what happened.
Right.
Poor education, no jobs, family destroyed, you become an anarchist and you want to destroy. And every country that, when autocracy wins, is when you have a large minority of those kinds of people. Happens in Tsarist Russia, in Germany, in Cuba, in Venezuela, in Argentina, wherever, in Hungary, wherever you have this inequality, lack of fairness, lack of hope, lots of anarchy, that's what happens. And I'm working really hard to try to say to our business leaders, we've got to change the version of capitalism. From shareholder primacy, where the only person that matters to a business is the shareholder, maximizing short-term shareholder value is the mantra. No, there are multiple critical stakeholders. And Jamie Dimon, head of JP Morgan Chase, when he was chairman of the Business Roundtable, came along and said, no, business should also worry about society and its workers. And that opened the floodgates. So right now we're in the middle of a battle. Which version of capitalism should he take?
Sounds like a book.
Sounds like time for an activist, Peter Georgescu, to go out there, bayonet in hand, trench warfare, to make sure that the right version of capitalism happens. So I'm doing my best.
Well, part and parcel, we're in the beginning, well, we're in the middle of election. And tell us what about voting and why you vote, why you don't vote, why people should vote, why people should be involved in the voting process.
Well, I believe in democracy. It's all about people. That's what it is. What I benefited from was the nature of American democracy. I was a people, I was a person in need. I was cared for. That's why the principle of Exodus said, this kid was deprived of the opportunity. And democracy is about opportunity. Democracy is not to say we empower this group or another. The bad part of capitalism and autocracy is all about a small minority controlling everything else by force. That's what autocracy is. And that's the alternative to democracy. Socialism is a version of, well, that's what communism is, a form of socialism, as most people don't understand. Socialism is the control of means of distribution and production. And then you control that, you control everything else. Mm-hmm. And democracy, when the role of business is also society, where the shareholders win, the workers win, the company wins, that's stakeholder capitalism. That's the business form of capitalism and of the business form of democracy. Everybody wins because at the end of the day, you got to do what's right for the customer. You got to do what's right by workers. You got to do what's right by the company itself. And now we got to worry about the planet too. Because that's another home, another community that we better worry about a lot.
Sure. We again, back to the process of voting. We vote to put people into public office.
Well, yes, but you see what happened. Greg, the notion is that democracy is all about the common good. It's about we, not I. Mm-hmm. It's about we. And the common good left town. In the shareholder primacy era, empowered narcissism entitlement. If it's good for me, if it feels good for me, that's all that matters. It's not about you, it's about me. That's not democracy. That's not how democracy works. Democracy works with values and compassion. Underneath the whole principle of that version of capitalism is it's all about us. We, the people. We, the people, also have to win. And the better version of capitalism, the better it produces good value. That's how a company started. A company started coming together when it became clear that they're all farmers back then, that bringing a whole bunch of farmers together, working together for the benefit of the many, you produce more food.
Sure.
And you can distribute more. That was the heritage. And business did that in the contemporary modern world. And that's why at the end of the day it's all about we the people. We all have to vote. We all have to have equal opportunity. It's not about equal success. That's not it. Or equal incomes. No. No. It all depends on your energy, your willingness to work, your willingness to use your mind that you came with or develop your mind better. But the key issue is opportunity, 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 not outcome. Opportunity is the issue of the democracy. Make sure that, and our education in America is not that. We have horrible public education. We rank at the bottom of the developed world. That's the African community's curse, is that horrible education. Education has to start at the age of 3 for every child in America. And the quality of education has to be extraordinary. It was the best in the world at one point in time. It's now one of the worst in the world. Mm-hmm. Oh, sure, we have some of the best universities, the best prep schools, the best high schools. Not the majority of them. Not for most of the people. That's not democracy, huh? So that's where we have to go. We have to put people in government, in business leadership who understood and understand that. That's why I'm optimistic. Because I believe the best days of America are ahead, not behind us. It's good. We did good. But that's not the dream that Jefferson had. All men are created equal. Hello? And everybody's entitled to their pursuit of happiness. So that's the dream. It's still there. It's alive. And we can do it.
You're here today at the Robert H. Jackson Center, in many instances because of the power of the press. Congresswoman Bolton took your message to the press. It came in many forms and fashions. Today, here you run it 70 years later, well, almost to the
70,
day.
yes, 70 years.
Later, almost to the
Yes.
day, where you got off of Idlewild. Now LaGuardia, right?
No, Kennedy.
Kennedy, excuse me, I'm sorry. Oh, man, I missed that. What does the power of the press, as you see it today, I mean, you've seen it evolve. You were in the business. You were in the branding business. You were in the research business. Now today, as it plays out, and it gets the press gets a lot of bad press as an influencer.
Look, let's not blame the press. Press is an inanimate thing. Press is the people. Mm-hmm. Back to the people. Who controls the press? Who controls, like business? You know, there is something called the truth. Let's not debate that. Truth is a fact. Mm-hmm. There are facts and there's truth for most everything. There's not a whole lot to debate that. You can debate the implication of the truth. You can debate how they get there. You can debate lots of things. But at the end of the day, the truth is the truth. And the fact is the fact. And the challenge we have today is we as a society are in a process of trying to say, well, the truth doesn't matter because if I don't like it, I'm going to change the truth. I take a brush and paint over the truth and create a new truth, whatever it is that I like. Baloney. So we are capable as people to do things like that. And we're not going to discuss who we are as human beings, how we got here. But the reason we survive for millennia, not millennia, for millions of years, in the jungle is that we learned also to be cruel. When we came and became bipedal from the tree, for whatever reason they came down, some geological catastrophe, whatever happened, they were forced to become bipedal. And they had to live with the lions and the tigers and all these predators out there. And we're not the fastest and we're not the strongest, so we had to be the cunningest and the cleverest. And we didn't just had to harm them, we need to kill them. Because if we just harm them, we were toast. And so we acquired different skills and different attitudes, and those genes are still with us. Yeah. And so the challenge for us as society is to learn on the other genetic part of us, the good. And I did write a book. Whether you like the book or not, that's not the point, but I love the title, The Constant Choice. Because we all wake up in the morning and decide, who do we want to be? And you make a decision and you live by it. And so underneath the way of life of a country with a vision and a dream is to understand the common good and to care about that and be driven by that. And the common good means we have to believe in the truth. And we have to, at the end of the day, be able to convince ourselves that we're not going to misrepresent the truth, lie about the truth. And we got to believe in the people who really want the truth to be, for better or for worse, it is what it is. And if it's bad, fix it. Not by lying, not by brushing some other vision of the truth, but by the truth. And we have to go back to that. And I think I have this yearning as much as a vision that AI eventually, when it knows everything about everything that we know humans, the AI might be able to empower us to be able to find that truth quickly. So when somebody says something else that other than the truth, it can raise a red flag and say, no, that's not the truth. Something else is the truth. Because right now, too many people on social media, and basically, what's the difference with social media? Social media can say anything because we allow it to be without consequence for too long. We chose to do that. It's stupid. In regular networks or magazines or whatever, you are responsible for what you say. And that's why Fox News had to pay close to $800 million because they lied and they did some damage. But social media is immune for that. Just like apparently the president is immune from everything he does. How ludicrous is that? So we have to go back to the truth, to the simple values, not political warfare here. It's not about left and right, it's doing the right thing for the benefit of the people. That's why I love democracy. That's why we all love democracy at the end of the day. We know that's the best way. It's messy, it's not simple. You struggle with it. It's easy to believe, well, let me paint the truth, whatever I want to do it, and I'll dictate that that's the way it's going to be. And that's what totalitarianism is. It's pretty simple. It's force, it's power, it's subjugating. Those are not our better angels. And I'm optimistic. I think we know, I think the majority of people around the world understand that at the end of the day, we need to really care about the truth. We need to care about each other. And as we are facing the kind of catastrophic challenges like COVID, because there will be other COVIDs, and the planet is about ready to burn up on us or drown us. And we've got to understand that we're here one little family, and we better play together for our common good. And this is exemplar that our forefathers in America who created this nation with this idea That's all it is. It's an idea. The pursuit of happiness for all these people who are equal and they deserve equal opportunity. And that's why I believe it may happen in my lifetime, unlikely, but I care that about now my 4 granddaughters. They're entitled to that. Darn it. Why not?
Sure.
It's the better way to go in life.
I wish you got some passion in your voice, you know? Yeah, as you wrap up, and I appreciate all of your time, Peter, that, and I'm a firm believer that you got to know where you came from to know where you're going to. And you've come from an incredible story. How do you, in maybe 3 minutes or less, but how do you wrap that up? How does you kind of, the Peter Georgescu arc, life arc?
It just occurs to me, given this conversation, Greg, that we've had, that the answer is very simple. I'm just a product of that idea. Not me, but the people who helped me get there. I'm just a simple product of people who cared. That's how I am, where I am, and who I am. It's all about that. About them, not about me. It's about Francis Bolton. It's about William Gurdon Saltonstall. It's about so many other bosses or the people who worked for me, who guided me often to be a better person. The exemplars of so many other great people that I've had, the Harold Burson of this world. He was one of the most humble people I know. Because it wasn't about him. It's not about me. It's about them. And when you get that, you're free. There are no burdens anymore. You have nothing to prove. You just got to get up in the morning and figure out who you want to be.
Yeah.
So it's not complicated. So I'm lucky to have had the help that I have gotten to be able to see and appreciate, and the privilege of being able to work to help others do this. And that's my mission in life. That's why I'm here. Well, I think we all have to ask ourselves that question. I'm now in my 86th year. Why the hell am I here? Not to eat bonbons. Thank you. I really enjoyed this conversation, Greg.
Wow, yeah, as do I. We're the beneficiaries of a tremendous life well lived and continues to be lived with a great, great message. Peter, thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
And there you go. Thank you, partner.
Thank you.